Chapter 5. What did hinder you? As children, you have all played the game where you make chalk marks, little squares on the sidewalk. Somebody chases you until you're inside one of the square boxes and you cannot get out until you pay a forfeit. Who says you cannot get out? There's only a chalk mark there to keep you in, but the rules of the game say you must remain there, and so you do. That is good fun as long as it is a game. But would it not be tragic if the other children went home while you were in that box and did not release you, and you felt that you could not get out of the box? And yet, all you would have to do would have been to step across those lines. The Master Christ, Jesus, watched people imprisoned by chalk marks, multitudes of them. They sat crippled at the gates and in the streets, but he merely looked at them and said, "Wilt thou be whole? Rise, take up thy bed and walk." And they arose and walked. They found that there was nothing hindering them. They were just obeying a rule of human life, which says that under certain conditions or at a certain age, a person may be paralyzed, and this they had accepted. Jesus saw the chalk mark there, and in his conviction that there was nothing hindering them, they got up and walked. To Lazarus he said, "Lazarus, come forth." And Lazarus came forth. What was hindering him? The rules of the game of human life. So people will continue to suffer until somebody comes along who sees that the laws of sin, disease, and lack are chalk marks, and in his spiritual discernment asks, "What did hinder you?" The Master told us that we must become as little children in order to accept the truth. Very often the reason for delayed healing is the spiritual healer's inability to be childlike enough to see a white chalk line where someone else has seen a death date or accepted a certain period as necessary for the disease to run its course. People see 3 chalk marks instead of 1 when it is in an incurable disease, and they are locked more tightly than ever in their prison. An incurable disease. What can be worse than that? As a matter of actual fact, spiritual healing often has far greater success with incurable diseases than with the curable ones, because when a doctor says, "I've done all I can do," the patient gives up hope of cure from materia medica, and in his hopelessness, he is receptive and responsive to the spiritual impulse. Only those with chalk marks, called time, diagnoses, symptoms, or appearances, can make you believe that you're a prisoner of a disease or a sin. The only requirement for freedom is to skip across that line. And why not? What is hindering you? A belief? A theory? When you recognize it as but a belief or a theory, all the white chalk lines begin to disappear out of your life because they are not there as barriers. They're there only as appearances. When Peter was in prison, all the iron bars and locks were real and seemingly impossible to break. Then the angel of the Lord appeared, the miracle happened, and he was outside the prison. But the bars were still there, and the locks were still there. Hezekiah told his people in their moment of battle, when they were facing a superior enemy, "With him is an arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord of our God to help us and to fight our battles." When you're faced with a problem, physical, mental, moral, financial, please remember, this is but the arm of flesh, trying to convince me that it has power, but it has no power. It is only an arm of flesh. Bunch together all the errors, sin, disease, infection, contagion, death, lack, limitation, weather, climate, and summarily dispose of them as the arm of flesh. Not worth fighting. Then you'll begin to heal, and not only then, and not Then you will begin to heal, and not until then. You bring yourself close to the kingdom of God when God becomes the all in all, and when every problem is dismissed as the arm of flesh, the white chalk line, no hindrance, nothingness, because you have come to understand the true nature of God as infinity, omnipresence, omniscience, infinite wisdom, divine love. Intellectually knowing this is inspiring. Entertaining it in thought is a grand experience, but one day something comes right up in front of you and says, I'm a beggar, I'm a cripple, I'm a cold, I am a cancer, consumption, unemployment, lack, limitation. And you begin to tremble all over. Then you discover that whereas you've been voicing the word, you have not come face to face with the reality of it. And now you must begin to put it into practice and face this so-called enemy. Face it. Look right at it and see if you cannot translate it into white chalk mark or the arm of flesh, and thereby come to the absolute conviction, I, God, in the midst of me, is the all in all. You out there, you are just a white chalk mark, the arm of flesh. Just for a moment, imagine that you're experiencing an unpleasant dream. You're in the ocean, swimming. You have gone out too far. You look back toward the shore and see that there's very little hope of rescue. Even though you shout your lungs out, no one can hear you. And so you're seized with fear. You struggle and strive to reach the shore, and of course, the harder you fight, the harder the ocean fights you. There's only one thing left for you to do: drown. Yes, drown. But wait! In your fight, you shouted and someone heard you, came over and shook you, woke you up. And behold the miracle. The drowning self disappeared, the ocean disappeared, the struggle disappeared. You awakened and found that you had never left your comfortable home. All that was necessary in order to be released from the struggle was to awaken. This is the nature of spiritual healing. Whether you're struggling with some form of sin or false appetite, disease, poverty, unemployment, or unhappiness, stop struggling and wake up. Wake up to your true identity. You're not a swimmer in a deep ocean. You're not a sufferer in sin or disease. You're the Christ consciousness, a child of God. And the very error you are fighting, you are perpetuating by that fighting. There is no need to struggle. Relax in the realization that in all this universe, there is only God appearing as you and as me. God's own undivided selfhood is individualized as you and me. Divine harmony is your destiny. It is the destiny of every individual, whether he's living a good health life, whether he's living in good health or bad, whether he's living in saintliness or sinfulness. The ultimate destiny of every one of us is divine harmony when we awaken. I shall be satisfied when I awake with thy likeness. When you begin to grasp the meaning of awakening, then you will realize that the so-called errors of this world, the sins and the diseases, the lacks, the limitations, do not exist as actual conditions or states of being, but as illusory pictures or concepts in mind. That makes them just as painful or annoying as they were when you were suffering from them, but it also makes it possible for you to be healed from them. You cannot be healed spiritually while you accept a sin, a disease, or a lack as an actual condition. It is only possible to heal spiritually when you know the unreal nature of that which is causing the trouble in your experience. Those of you who have studied metaphysics have been taught that the nature of sin and disease is illusion. You have been taught to call it mortal mind or nothingness. Most students, that illusion or that mortal mind or nothingness still remains as something to be healed or removed. But nobody should have anything to get rid of after he knows that what has been troubling him is an illusion. If somebody saw a ghost over in a corner and said, "Get rid of it," you would understand that he was seeing a ghost as an it in the comer. But after he had awakened to the fact that this was an illusion, what would you think of him if he persisted in saying, "Get rid of it"? Once you perceive that which Jesus called this world, that is, the material sense of a universe, is really an illusion, you will know why the great master could overcome the world. He overcame it through the understanding that it was an illusion. Therein lay the overcoming. And if you are to follow an example set by Jesus, you too will have to learn that the only way in which you can overcome this world is through knowing that a thing is not the thing you perceive it to be. A condition is not the condition you perceive it to be. A person is not the person you perceive him to be. What you're dealing with always is illusion. And knowing that it is an illusion should dissolve it, and will if there is real conviction in your knowing. All the discord in the world is the product of the mind when it is distorted by ignorance. This state of incomplete apprehensiveness, this state of incomplete apprehension of the real and eternal is often spoken of in the infinite way as a state of hypnotism. Anyone who has watched the response of a nation or of a crowd to propaganda should be able readily to understand how easily mass hypnotism can be produced when those affected are under stress and strain. In such cases, there is no person acting as a hypnotist per se, nor is there a specific subject upon whom he works, but nevertheless, the effect produced is hypnotic, in that it is characterized by marked susceptibility to suggestion and loss of willpower. Those affected by it had nothing to do with its promulgation or dissemination, and are part of it only as victims of mass hypnotism. An individual is, in a sense, born hypnotized by the very fact of being born into the human predicament. Everyone about him perceives the material manifestation as the real existence, so that he too falls under the spell. In other words, he is hypnotized. There is a universal mesmerism which strikes one person as disease, one as false appetite, one as sensuality, one as poverty, and another as something else. It is universal hypnotism, and everybody, by virtue of having been conceived in his mother's womb, is a victim of it. The effect of this universal hypnotism is to make a person accept disease, death, lack, limitation, unemployment, depression, wars, or accidents as reality. Lay the axe at the root of the tree. Do not bother about picking off the branches. Do not bother about healing a little piece of flesh here and a little false appetite there. Release that in healing you are not dealing with a person or a condition per se. You are dealing with universal hypnotism. To help you arrive at an understanding of the universal nature of hypnotism, I call to your mind the studies of subliminal perception that have been made in recent years. It has been found that many people respond to suggestions of which they are not even aware. For example, in a motion picture theater, where these experiments were being conducted, slides instructing the audience to go into the lobby during the intermission to buy popcorn and Coca-Cola were flashed upon the screen so rapidly as to be imperceptible. Even though these slides were invisible to the eye and did not register consciously in the mind, people in the audience went downstairs in unprecedented numbers and bought Coca-Cola and popcorn, which they may not have which they may not particularly have wanted. They did not hear anybody tell them to do it. They did not consciously see any advertising, but they responded to suggestions which they did not even know they had received, and thereby found themselves acting out of something of which they themselves had no knowledge. It is plain that if these suggestions had been made directly to them with their knowledge, they could have used their judgment or discrimination as to whether or not they should buy. If you understand how this mesmerism operates, you'll know why it is that everybody is a victim of the ills of this world until he comprehends the nature of these errors. Those people in the theater could just as well have picked up, "You have a cold." They could just as well have picked up, "You have cancer," or "You have fear." You know this is true because you have undoubtedly had many days when you have felt fearful without knowing whence or why it came. But had you gone outside, you probably would have seen a headline in a newspaper, or had you turned on your radio, you might have found that the radio headlines were blaring forth some story of disaster. Your fear was the result of a universal hypnotism. It was not you. It was the universal thing that runs from person to person, place to place, situation to situation, and all of a sudden you find yourself as a victim of it. Such an approach is quite different from that used in most mental healing, whether it is accomplished through one of the modern mental science organizations, or whether it is accomplished by psychology or psychiatry, all of which rests primarily upon the thesis that lurking in a person's thought is error of some kind, and it can only be rooted out, healing, and if it can only be rooted out, healing will follow. Cancer, tuberculosis, arthritis, whatever the disease, all are attributed to erroneous thinking or to some undesirable trait of character on the part of the patient. Some practitioners probe into the human mind in an attempt to uncover the error, to point out to the patient that his problems stem from his jealousy, sensuality, miserliness, malice, or hatred. It would seem to some problems apparently do stem from these undesirable qualities. On the human level of life, and as long as a human being lives in the world, he is inevitably such a part of the world consciousness, and he unsuspectingly or unknowingly takes on the complexion of that consciousness. Perhaps you've had the experience of being told that if you had been just a little more loving, or a little more generous, or a little more grateful, or a little sweeter to some relative, you would not now be struggling with whatever your particular problem may be. And that if you hope to have a healing, you'll have to begin to be forgiving and kind, loving, considerate, patient, or generous. This is psychology. This is mind science, in which your physical and mental disease is usually laid at the door of a mental cause. Furthermore, mental treatment is directed at the patient. Sometimes the name of the patient is taken into the treatment, or the name of the disease. Jane Smith, you're God's perfect child. You're well and you know it. You're spiritual. Jane Smith, you are free. Jane Smith, you are perfect. Jane Smith, you are this. Jane Smith, you are that. That is the way the treatment is addressed, although the truth is that Jane Smith, a human being, is not any of those things. All that such a metaphysician knows about God and the image and likeness of God is being pounded into Jane as if Jane were already that. By hammering away at Jane, telling her that she is already spiritual and already perfect, the mental scientist hopes to make her become that. Spiritual healing is entirely different from any of these approaches. In spiritual healing, as taught and practiced in the infinite way, there is no mental cause. That is, no individual mental cause for physical disease. True, there is a mental cause for a physical effect, but that is not personal to the individual. It is universal mesmerism in human consciousness, a universal belief in selfhood apart from God, which is hypnotic in its effect. Under this universal hypnosis, no matter what the disease, the patient is no more responsible for it than he is responsible for the wrong thinking that it's supposed to have produced it. Do not be so metaphysical as to believe that he brought it on himself with his wrong thinking, or maybe grandma did. Do not believe it. He is no more responsible for that wrong thinking than he is for the so-called effects of the wrong thinking, because in both cases he is but a victim of a universal belief, a universal hypnotism, which he has accepted and which you and I have accepted. In other words, if you are jealous, envious, or dishonest, you are not to be condemned for that. And furthermore, you are never going to be free from these errors until someone or some understanding comes into your experience to show you how to correct them. You will not correct them merely by trying to be a better human being. You will not be able to correct them by deciding, I'm going to stop being jealous, or I'm going to stop being dishonest. It cannot be done that way. It has been tried for generations and it has not succeeded, and it will not succeed now. Something more is needed. Something must be introduced into your consciousness which will free you from wrong thinking, and which will make wrong thinking an impossibility in your experience. The first step is to stop condemning yourself. Stop blaming yourself for your sins. Stop blaming yourself for your shortcomings. Stop blaming yourself for your errors. You will get nowhere by condemning either yourself or your neighbor. Remove this condemnation from yourself and realize that to whatever degree you are expressing negative qualities of mind and body, to that extent you have permitted world beliefs to be imposed upon you. Begin to understand that the nature of your being is God. The nature of your soul is God. The nature of your mind is God. And the nature of your body is the temple of God. Your very body is the temple of the living God. Stop condemning it. Stop hating it. Stop fearing it. Your mind is an instrument through which God, truth, can flow. Do not condemn your mind, and do not call it a bad mind or a mortal mind or a material mind. There are no such minds. There is only one mind, and that mind is an instrument of God. When you stop condemning yourself, when you stop condemning your mind, you will find that your mind is a clear transparency for the soul. If you have had any experience at all with pets or with children, you must certainly know that condemning and punishing them and telling them how bad they are, or how naughty or how wicked, is no way to bring out the good in them. That is no way to bring out the good in anyone or anything. The way to bring out good in a child or an animal or a flower or in any growing thing is to love it, to bless it, to realize that God is the very essence of its being and that God constitutes its nature. When a person comes to you for help, do not sit in judgment on him. Do not criticize him. Do not blame him. Do not look around for his sins or of omission or commission, because even if he has any, they are only effects. They are not cause. Behind every fault and failure there is a cause, but the cause is never personal. The cause is universal hypnotism. This explains how people become sick or sinful, how they develop false appetites and desires, why they are weak enough to get drunk or foolish enough to be reckless in their driving. It is not that they themselves want to be that way. This universal hypnotism strikes people unbeknownst to themselves, acting upon them so that when the world says it is raining outside, thousands of people catch a cold. A spiritual healer is a person who understands that he is not dealing with colds, with cancer, consumption, or polio. He is not dealing with prenatal influences. He is not dealing with change of life or old age. He is dealing with a misapprehension of reality, hypnotism, mesmerism, suggestion. These are not entities or identities. Hypnotism is something that causes a mental image, but that image is always without substance, law, or cause. And the moment the hypnotism is destroyed, the image is also destroyed. So let us see how this process operates. I invite you to close your eyes, turn your mind to a street, any street that you like, any street that you know. Look at the houses there, all kinds and all descriptions. Here a brick one, there a stone one, all over there a wooden one. Out in front of these are fresh green lawns, and over in this lawn a rose bed, and over on that lawn one asters or zinnias. There are scores of children playing, and in the street an occasional automobile rushes by. You might even picture one of the children running out in front of one of the speeding vehicles and hear the screeching of the brakes and a child's scream. The doorbell rings, or the telephone. Immediately you open your eyes. The dream is gone. Where are all the houses, the children, and the accident? They have vanished because the dream cannot create houses. A dream cannot create children. A dream cannot create accidents. A dream's substance can create nothing but substanceless images. And so it is with hypnotism. A hypnotist can make you see a dozen monkeys dancing around in your room, but there will be no one there. On the other hand, suppose you're so hypnotized that you're certain that the donkeys are there. How are you going to get rid of them? There's only one way. Break the hypnotism. Break the hypnotism by calling upon the subject to awaken. And then what happens to the forms? They disappear. In spiritual healing, whether the claim is named Jones, Brown, Smith, whether the claim is named cancer, consumption, or polio, whether the claim is called unemployment, depression, or unhappy relationships, do not be tricked into treating persons or conditions. Leave them alone and get back to the substanceless substance to which you can give any name you like. The carnal mind, hypnotism, suggestion. It can be anything as long as you interpret it as meaning nothingness, no substance, no law, no cause. When you really begin to comprehend that in healing you are not dealing with people as people, when you learn to eliminate them and their specific claims from your thought, and in every instance deal with the root of the problem, the carnal mind, nothingness, the arm of the flesh, nothingness, you will find how quickly you will be able to become consciously aware of a spiritual presence within you. This presence cannot be felt until you're free of the barrier. The barrier is the belief in two powers. The barrier is the belief in something apart from God. If you prefer the word temptation can be used in place of hypnotism. When you feel ill, you might look upon that as a temptation coming to you for acceptance or rejection. The only way you can reject the temptation is to recognize it as the arm of the flesh or nothingness. No matter what is brought to you, whatever its name or nature, no matter who it is, the carnal mind is not the opposite of the divine mind, and you're not looking for divine mind to do something to a carnal mind. The minute you have made the carnal mind a nothingness, the arm of the flesh, you no longer have two powers, and you can do just what it says in Scripture: rest in His Word. You can rest in His Word, waiting for the Spirit of the Lord to be upon you, and when it comes, it breaks the hypnotism. For years after I had learned to recognize that all forms of sin, disease, lack, limitation, depression, and whatnot are mesmeric sense, or hypnotism, the puzzle was to discover how to break that hypnotism for a person. What could I do? A hypnotist just snaps his finger and his subject awakens, or he wills him to awaken. This I could not do because on the spiritual path I am not permitted to use physical or mental power. It was then that I discovered that scriptural passage which you will find throughout all my writings. The stone was cut out of the mountain without hands. By the time I'd spent some months puzzling on this obscure meaning, the answer began to be apparent. The weapon against error, our offense and defense, is something that is neither physical or mental. No action, no words, no thoughts, only the awareness of God. As you carry this out in practice, watching the stone being formed in and of your consciousness while you stand on one side as a witness or a beholder, eventually a state of peace will come. Then you will catch a glimpse of God as is, not a power over anything, just God is. You begin to understand that no power does anything to anyone, and you become a beholder of reality as it begins to appear. All problems fade in proportion as you develop this ability to be quiet, to behold, to witness divine harmony unfold. And because of the principle of oneness, your patient experiences this harmony. The principle behind this process is that inasmuch as the activity of the human mind is the substance and the activity of hypnotism, when the human mind is not functioning, there is no more hypnotism. When you are not thinking thoughts or words, when you are in stillness, the human mind is stopped. The hypnotism is gone. When you experience this, you will feel something which transcends the human dimension of life. Do not battle the forms of error. Do not try to lop off rheumatism or consumption or cancer. Do not try to lop off old age. Do not try to change the appearance world. Get back. Realize that in reality God constitutes your being, and the only thing from which you are suffering is a universal belief in two powers. Get back and rest in the Word. If you battle one phase of error and defeat it, 10 others may pop up to take its place. You have to wipe out that which is the cause of the human discord. And what is that? The fabric of nothingness. This so-called carnal mind, which is not a power except to those who are eternally fighting evil. If, with every claim that comes to you, you can set aside any thought of a person involved, his name and the nature of claim, and can go back to some word or term which to you represents nothingness, not something that has to be taught or fought against, not something that has to be risen above, just nothingness, so that you have the only power. Then you can sit in meditation and you will feel the descent of the Holy Ghost. You'll feel the peace that passes your understanding. You will feel a divine presence and a release from fear or discord. Consciously remember as you go into your meditation that you're not praying for the purpose of changing, healing, reforming, or correcting anything or anybody. Establish this clearly in your mind. I'm going into meditation, but there's no person involved. There's no condition involved. My meditation has nothing to do with the person, and it has nothing to do with the condition. It has to do with realizing a spiritual presence right where I am. So now I'm going to be silent and let that realization take place. All that is necessary for harmony is God's grace realized. You do not have to know a lot of deep metaphysics. You have to know the simple things, the very simple things, such as revelation of one power and the nothingness of the armies of the aliens. You understand that God is something more than word. God is much more even than a long list of synonyms. God is an experience, and no one knows God until he has had that experience.